Consulting this morning, the topic, Cuties, the movie, Netflix, they're under fire over this whole thing, losing subscribers at 8-fold. Last report I had, very gratuitous.
Oh, so it's most things men's mental health. That's
Right.
the entire purpose. So let's just start with the background of the movie. When I first turned it on, being that she is a black Muslim and speaking French, I thought that they were in North Africa.
Right.
It took me a second to realize that they're in Paris and that they're a transplant from Senegal. So in knowing that, initially she has the entire garb on and all of these kinds of things, but the director is a Muslim woman who is also from Senegal. And so this is kind of her take on hypersexualization and what social media is doing to women. And she claims that this is a feminist film, that it speaks to the rights of Muslim women. And so my take on it was probably a little bit different than the average American. But
Right.
Let's just start with what you were saying about how it was distasteful. It's
specifically scenes of her becoming a woman, we'll call it. I don't need the graphic presentation, number one. I had real big issues with her taking a picture of her genitalia and then using that on social media. However, I do know that that's really an issue that's going on out there.
It is an issue.
But to see such a young girl doing something like that, even though it didn't reveal any of that, it left me feeling really dirty.
So that... Okay, you have to realize that you're the typical American, and I don't mean that in a bad way.
Right.
I mean that in this film was not meant for America type way. This film was meant for Europe, Asia, Chinese culture, Thai culture. It was not meant for American culture. She's a French director, Senegalese, and grew up in Paris, and so her take on this and our take on this is very different. It is not a Netflix production. So when people say they're mad at Netflix is just the broadcasting station. Sundance is the actual film production. But again, as Americans, we are so hypocritical in some senses, because look at our commercials. Look at our razor commercials and how they advertise razors to women.
I totally get it. It's not an isolated event.
Yes, it's not an isolated event. So one question I would have to pose to people is, are we the knee-jerk reaction because it's a foreign film and we dislike the sexuality? Is it a knee-jerk because it has Muslims in it? Or is it a knee-jerk because of adolescents and the way they are so hypersexual in the film?
I think that the outrage came from being in the realm of pedophilia, helping to open the door and to more normalize pedophilia in America and to more sexualize younger and younger children. I think that's where the outcry came, and this film did exploit, even though they're paid actors and actresses. I mean, I get that, and they're telling the story.
So here's the issue with saying that it's pedophilic in the film, is that there's no adult perpetrating on these children. So the argument from people is that it perpetuates pedophilia within our culture, which, we're sexualizing women younger and younger again. In an objective point of view, this film is no different than watching Dance Moms. Have you ever watched Dance Moms
I've never
before?
watched that, but
it's incredibly graphic.
I do understand that there are many that have compared this to the pageant world,
yes.
to other things that also do similar things.
However, my counter argument to that, having treated registered sex offenders before at the federal and state level, is that when you have offenders, and this isn't a secret, I'm giving to them, they already know this, so regular people shouldn't freak out that I'm about to say this. When you are a registered offender and you want to find sexual arousal and not violate your probation agreement, and you want to pass a polygraph, this is the content that you go look for.
Really?
And I know that because my offenders have done that in the past.
And so they will seek this out.
So they will seek this out, and they will use it for sexual gratification, and they will still pass their polygraph, which is why when I had my polygrapher give guys, occasionally a woman, but when I had the guys have a polygraph exam, the question wasn't, have you viewed pornographic material? It's, have you viewed material of adolescent girls that's sexually arousing to you? Because they'll go online and they'll find National Geographic films, they'll go watch Dance Moms, they'll go watch films like this, and so technically it's not quote-unquote pornographic. They will pass the polygraph, but ultimately they're still using the content for sexual purposes.
Right, and that's disturbing to a lot of people that
should be.
a grown man would look at an 11-year-old and use that imagery or personality expressed in the film to find sexual gratification from it.
Well, and you know, I mean, people have sexual thoughts all the time that they don't act on. So there's a big difference between having the thought and then acting on it. Okay. I personally, after I watched the film, I felt like the hypersexual issues was really just kind of the shallow issue, if you will. I felt like the much greater issue was the Muslim culture. And I say that in not the typical sense, because what has happened after the film is that CARE, which is an American and Islam organization that is technically a non-profit in the United States. CARE has denounced this, as we expect that they would. They are claiming that it is stereotypical and Islamophobic toward Muslims, which I think is quite ironic, because in reality, had this girl taken those actions, showing her body, dancing the way she is, she would have been beaten. She would have been stoned if we're in the Arab world.
Right.
She would have been potentially killed. Her genitals would have been disfigured. So for them to say that it's stereotypical Islam, I would have to argue that, because the punishment isn't even stereotypical.
Well, I did notice the reaction along the film as she becomes more, in the beginning she's dressed very traditional Muslim, very conservative. But as time goes on, she is more and more modern worldly, we'll call it, and there seem to be very few ramifications from the family. I think the grandmother made a few comments, but other than that, they almost embraced her in the end.
Which is not at all what would happen in the typical Muslim culture. And so her father is out finding a second wife. Do you know why people find second wives in the Muslim world?
I have no idea, because one is more than I've ever been able to manage. I'm telling you, this guy is a glutton for punishment.
Men find second wives because they're dissatisfied with the first. That's why.
Come on.
Yes, that is exactly why.
It's in your head, though, isn't it? I mean, you can be satisfied with...
I get that, but that's not the Muslim purpose for having multiple wives. When you are dissatisfied with the first, or she no longer meets your needs, quote unquote, you are free to go find a second wife. So what does that tell you in the film? The first wife is already devastated that she's no longer good enough, which is why she says, I hope they marry for love. I hope they marry for love.
Which she forced herself to say, because she obviously did not
She's
feel
obviously
that way.
devastated.
And she is basically following her faith at that point.
Yes. And so father is out of town. He is back in Senegal.
With a younger woman taking a second wife.
And
of course
she will
he's
be
over
the
there.
second wife, yes. And so understanding that and making speculation that they're probably of the Sunni, more traditional sect, which is about 90% of Senegal and really 90% of Muslims as a whole, you know, we can take the stance that they're of the conservative facet, which is why when she's wearing midriff items and she's showing skin and there's no physical punishment, I find that hard to believe in the Muslim culture. And so for the director to produce this, she is saying, this is my representation of hypersexual behavior. This is the struggle that this girl faces. And the girl sees that the more sexualized women are, the more successful they become. But the problem is she is taking action, but she doesn't understand the meaning behind the actions.
One thing.
But it's interesting that you say parenting. For the veteran population, those men and few women that have served overseas in an Arab country, I guarantee if you're a veteran and you go watch this, you're going to have the same thought process I did about the Muslim culture. And if you are not catching that tone, you must be tone deaf, because it is very blatant and evident. And the parenting in the Muslim world is all left to the woman. The father is the disciplinarian, and that is it. That is basically his role. And so when you think about parenting, mom is in chaos. She's not living the same life that you and I live, and
Dad's
so she's really just trying to meet her needs.
On his new wife,
on
and
wife number
sending
2.
gifts and things to the family.
In fact, I would almost argue that if father came back, that wife number 1 and potentially the daughter could be killed as a result of this, because this is absolute shame and disgrace to the household. And I would be willing to bet that almost every OIF veteran would agree with me on that.
Wow. Well, the film, ultimately, what's your thought on it? Should it be banned? Are people right in canceling subscriptions?
Well, I
Netflix?
really dislike a lot of shows on a lot of channels, but I don't cancel the channel, so to speak. I just don't watch the show. I mean, I get that people want to send a message that they're not okay with it, and I'm okay with that message. I also think that there should be different types of content out there, that we can't regulate free speech. We are in America.
Mhm.
That's one of our rights. So if you're unhappy with it, by all means, don't watch it. I will say this: if you are a parent, I would not show this to my child without watching it first. And here are the steps that I would take in doing that.
I just wouldn't let my kids watch this.
Well, it would depend on the age. If my kid were 16 or 17 or older, I would let them watch it with my supervision, with thorough explanation of what is actually going on in the movie,
Mhm.
how the Muslim culture is, what her behavior gets her, the double standard issue between men and women. It would not just be let's sit down and pop popcorn. This would be a thorough discussion between parent and child about what this movie really means, the problems with it, how it impacts our family, what is our belief system, do we agree or disagree with it, and how our choices make us who we are.
Right.
So if you can approach it with that stance, and your child is old enough and you think they're mature enough and you need to have this discussion, by all means, because the bottom line is this: the world, let me back up. If you do not educate your child on sex and sexual behavior, the internet and the world will. And
That's
I would
for sure.
much rather
For sure.
educate my child and have them be taught our family beliefs and what we believe than what's being taught on social media and the internet, because
And
that's a very dangerous place.
Like I said, if there's a hole there, they're going to fill it
Yes.
with improper things, because they
Yes.
just don't have the skill set, the wisdom, the knowledge to. There's a huge difference between knowledge and wisdom, too, by the way.
I also think that really I think maybe one of the biggest arguments is the title of the movie. That it's the title almost targets young adolescent girls,
Mhm.
but the film is not meant for young adolescent
Right.
girls, and so it's very misleading in that sense, which I think is maybe some of where the anger comes from.
Now, I know our time is coming to an end here, but I have to ask you, being that you deal with sexual offenders, and you probably have more insight into the mind of how an adult male could be sexually attracted to an adolescent or even younger, like just crazy stuff. I can't even imagine what you have to go home with sometimes. But does it bother you that they will use this film to look at those girls and to seek sexual gratification from it?
That's such a loaded question. Does it bother me?
And I'm sorry, yeah.
Well, I mean, it's not comforting by any means, but there is a small sect of the population that actually meets the diagnostic criteria for pedophilia, and everybody else is just an old-fashioned pervert, okay? Pedophilia is adolescents and younger, 14 and younger, no genitalia growth in that area, if you will, and under. And so most are not necessarily attracted to that sexually. They're just kind of in the young pervert realm of, yeah, she's 15 or 16. And do you remember, what was that 80s movie with Matthew McConaughey? And he said, I keep getting older, but they stay the same age.
What was it, Dazed and Confused?
Dazed and Confused.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. So Matthew McConaughey is the classic example of just being a pervert. There's a big difference between just being a pervert and being a pedophile. And those who are on probation, if you're a probation officer, you need to be changing your polygraph questions to, are you using non-pornographic content to meet your sexual needs? And that will tell you a lot more.
And what does the law say about that? To not pursue those feelings, those attractions?
The law can't tell you not to pursue feelings or attractions. It depends on when it's against the law. When consent and photos and internet pornography.
Right, child pornography,
Yeah.
bad thing. This
Mhm.
film, using it for sexual reasons.
Well, that's the thing,
Is
is the
that
film
still wrong?
the film rides the line. The film rides the line. It's quote unquote art. It's not necessarily pornographic, although I think there is partial nudity in there, at least at one point.
I think there's one scene where on a phone there's a breast exposed.
I think there's
but-
two of those actually.
Okay, maybe
and
so.
so technically it's not pornographic, if you will, but it is scandalous at the very least. And so you really have to think about, as a parent, what am I okay with, what am I not okay with, and weigh that. I definitely wouldn't watch it with your child unless you have watched it first. That way you can prepare for those conversations.
Right.
And if you're brave enough to do that,
My
By
cut
all
thing,
means.
leave it alone. Just don't even watch it.
but that's the problem, is that ignorance is not education. Ignoring something
I understand
does
that.
not make your children safer.
But I have to evaluate, did watching it benefit me in any way? Did it teach me anything in any way? And I really didn't feel like I learned
No,
anything
Of course
from
not.
it.
You're
I
not
already
you're not the target
know.
audience.
So
Yeah, you're not the
we're
target.
talking about Cuties, by the way, the Netflix film that's under so much controversy this morning. And I love your viewpoint. You really have one from an educated, experienced viewpoint, in everything from dealing with sex offenders to having all your training as a therapist.
It's a weird, bizarre place to sit.
But don't you? I mean, by allowing thoughts into your mind, I mean, isn't there a chance that that could grow?
Yes,
And so, isn't it? And that's kind of my point with this. If you just don't bring it in, it can't manifest into something larger.
And I get that, and I can see the value in that, because we have to protect what we put in our minds and bodies, okay? But the other side of that is ignorance is not education.
Mhm.
So just ignoring it and pretending that it's not there is not going to cut it.
Right.
It
Well,
will not cut
You're
it.
so fascinating. I appreciate your viewpoint on everything, and I love that you're so open-minded with it, and that you could look at it
Well,
and kind of
and-
explain to us what's really going on with the film.
And I definitely don't approve of it. I mean, I don't think it's great content by any means. It's
yeah,
just ironic.
I would never
because
watch it. if-
the bottom line is that she's trying to fight the oppression of women and fight the hypersexualization of young girls by using hypersexualized content. That makes no sense.
This morning, Lauren Rich Consulting, our guest this morning. You're listening with Cliff and the Fun Country Morning Show on Okie Country 101.7. It's pretty good.